love the channel and find it useful in becoming a happy retiree. Subscribe today. So good morning. We need to talk about when Washington meets Wall Street because there's so much happening in Washington. It's unavoidable to impact Wall Street. We've seen massive inflows in the last week to equity ETFs, those are exchange traded funds, and equity mutual funds. That means people are putting money back into the stock market, despite the Dow dropping 389 points this week. For the week, the Dow down 1.5%, the S&P 500 down 1.25%, the NASDAQ, tech-heavy, biotech-heavy NASDAQ down 1%. And, of course, new folks out of Washington. Let me just give a quick rundown. You've heard all of these folks out in Washington, but just as a quick reminder, Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, gone. He was there for 406 days. John McEntee, probably don't remember a lot of him. He was a personal aide. He was there for 417 days. Gary Cohn, he was the director of the National Economic Council and the chief economic advisor to President Trump, gone after 411 days. The innocent Hope Hicks, and I've actually communicated with Hope Hicks in the past. This is just a nice woman who meant no harm, probably could cause no harm if she tried, out after 405 days and having to do congressional testimony. Who's next on the list? Rob Porter. He was there for 384 days. He was the White House staff secretary. Omarosa, out of The Apprentice and out of the White House, that after 366 days. Diana Powell, out of the White House. She was the Deputy National Security Advisor, gone after 358 days. How about Tom Price? Remember him? Secretary of Health and Human Services, out after 232 days. And we could just keep going and going and going. This is a very, very long list. Oh, remember this guy? Steve Bannon, Chief Strategist and Senior Counselor to the President, out after 211 days. So I expected so much of this. Those folks and friends of mine that were thinking about going to Washington to be part of the administration after Trump was elected, the conversations that we had about what was going to happen in the first year was, hey, look, I bet you there's going to be a lot of turnover in that first year. You got a new guy who's never been a politician before. He doesn't exactly know how things work in Washington. He's going to bring people in that he thinks are going to work, and the chances of them working are probably low probability in that first year. And that's exactly what we have seen. I think the next year, I would think that there will be a lot more stability after the administration, and Trump himself has learned a lot more about the inner workings of Washington. Now, speaking of the inner workings of Washington, there's still an awful lot that goes on. So I think of Washington as this large working farm. There's so much going on. Let's call it 100 acres of activity, and they're growing soybeans and they're growing, I don't know, tobacco. It doesn't matter what they're doing. They've got horses and pigs and chickens on one end. They're growing some sort of crop on another end. They're raising cattle on the other side. They've got a stream that's powering a saw that's creating finished lumber. Maybe I'm going back a little bit in time, but there's a lot happening on this farm. And I think about when I was a kid, there was this large hornet's nest that would crop up once a year in I want to say this is a catalpa tree. And for those of you listening, maybe Walter Reeves from WSB Radio would know, there's a catalpa tree, which are a tree with these long banana-like beans that grow. They're like 1.5 feet long. And in this catalpa tree, a great hornet nest arose every single season. And my brothers and I would take rocks and throw rocks at this hornet's nest, and we would start 50 yards away and no one would hit the nest, and then we would creep up to 30 yards, and then we'd get 10 yards away, and there's just this buzzing hornet's nest. And the closest one to the hornet's nest to try to knock it down, which I don't think we ever did without getting stung, won the game. And Washington, or the White House itself, is that small but so active hornet's nest in the middle of that farm. All of the news is coming out of that house. All of the activity, it seems like, that wants to get covered is coming out of that one hornet's nest. But the real activity on that working farm, the real activity in Washington, D.C. is happening all around and far away from that hornet's nest, and that is the business of lobbying. And that is the business of activity of companies coming to Washington with a specific agenda, knowing exactly what they want their congressman or their congresswoman to do. Because whatever that congresswoman can do has a major impact on the line of business that that company runs. That's the real yeoman's work getting done in Washington. And despite President Trump saying no lobbyists, no more special interests, that hasn't remotely changed one bit. Washington is still this giant working farm, hundreds of acres, and hundreds and thousands of lobbyists working on what the agenda that they want worked on for their specific company that's paying them millions and millions of dollars. And that is the way that business gets done in Washington to this day. So that brings up something we talked about a year ago after we've covered the aerospace and defense industry, a great deal here on Money Matters. But we also talked about, we call this the policy opportunity portfolio. And this has been a way for me to track specific events happening in Washington, because you can identify a basket of companies that all have something in common that would all, let's say, do well if Democrats won, or a basket of companies that would do well if Republicans won. You can start to track and forecast political outcomes. And that's exactly the genesis of this policy opportunity portfolio, or this basket of companies that, in this particular case, was defined or is defined by lobbying intensity. How much are they spending? How much time, effort, energy, people, campaigns are they doing as a company to influence policy, to influence a policy that will impact their profits? And that still happens in great significance to this day in Washington. So this is something that I track. I actually invest in this. I have I have a big chunk of my retirement money in a strategy that follows lobbying intensity, because it still has a major impact on these companies. And I want to talk about this today and how we measure this lobbying intensity and what it means. So this portfolio has 50 companies. Now, most of these companies are pretty big companies. Some you would have heard of. Some are a little bit kind of middle-sized, still in the S&P 500. And I rank these companies not to account just for the dollars they spend in Washington, but their PR investments and how they are trying to shape public awareness and all these other efforts to reflect this exceptional effectiveness in lobbying and their lobbying efforts, and the potential for huge benefits to earnings. Now, research shows that lobbying activity and lobbying intensity can really have a huge impact on earnings. You can track these companies that are shaping policy, and they're driving their particular industry legislation, and they're furthering any sort of beneficial regulatory process that still helps them. And if you do that, and you find those companies, it's tremendous what will happen to the underlying stock. Now, if you're trying to find this ROI or some sort of return on investment metric, it's not as simple as just finding out who's spending the most. So Google, for example, spends about $10 million annually on lobbying. That has a much less impact on a company like Google than it does on a company, let's say a pharmaceutical company like Vertex Pharmaceuticals, let's say, who might spend the same amount, because Google's this massive company, it's an $800 billion market cap, $90 billion in annual revenue. Spending $10 million really is kind of a drop in the bucket for them. But Vertex is a $40 billion company delivering only $2 billion in revenue. Spending the same $10 million in Washington could have a big impact on the laws that are in coordination with how they earn a profit. We want to keep talking about lobbying in Washington. Despite the hornet's nest of activity, the real activity is on other parts of the working farm. Hi, I'm Wes Moss, and thanks for taking a minute to hear about what's so different about my new book, You Can Retire Sooner Than You Think. So unlike other retirement books, this book will give you a step-by-step guide, whether you're in your 20s or 30s or 40s or 50s, to learn from what these successful and happy retirees did to get there. I hope you enjoy the book, but more importantly, I know that it'll help you retire sooner than you think.